prosecution's account, and perhaps by some other accounts, Natalie Cochran is not a nice person. She defrauded friends, relatives, investors. She was involved in a Ponzi scheme. She cheated, she scammed. And she has paid for it. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the fact that she is perhaps a fraud and perhaps a cheat, and that you wouldn't perhaps want to invite her home for Sunday dinner, that you wouldn't like her, does not translate into being a murderer. This trial is not a forum on public acceptance. You don't have to like her. You don't have to say she is a great person. But you have taken the oath to judge her fairly and to give her a fair shake, a fair trial. When you took the oath, it's not just some wave of a hand. It is a solemn oath to search for the truth and to determine what really happened in this case. Now, the prosecutor presented a very nice theory, except that before we do that, again, I'm Matthew Victor. I represent Natalie Cochran with my co-counsel, Mr. Stanley Seldon. We represent somebody, again, who is perhaps dishonest in her financial dealings, but who didn't kill anybody, let alone her husband, her only man in her life, a man, the father of her 2 children, and a man with whom she was enamored ever since she laid eyes on him in high school. She's not a murderer, as the evidence will show. Now, she is accused here by the state of West Virginia of one of the vilest crimes there is known. And I will submit to you that the state's motive in this case, as they presented to you, is absolute nonsense. The state of West Virginia is trying to tell you that my client, Natalie Cochran, who has lived with the man who was up to his eyeballs in the Ponzi scheme, somehow detected that he was on her. He was already detecting that she was committing a major fraud, and he was going to run straight to the federal government. Well, think about it, ladies and gentlemen, as you listen to the evidence. The state would want you to believe that he didn't know anything about the Ponzi scheme, didn't know anything about millions of dollars and the lavish lifestyle. He didn't know anything about this, even though the evidence will show that he was signing all these contracts, he was working on the contracts, he was signing checks, and you will see that evidence, you will hear that evidence. And all of a sudden he found out that Natalie Cochran, his beloved wife, is a fraud and a cheat. And what was he going to do? No, he was not going to go and talk to her and try to resolve this case somehow, get a lawyer or no. The evidence will show, well, at least the state's evidence will show, that she's going to run to the federal government and turn her in and have the dear wife, the mother of his children, locked up in prison. Well, okay, think about that. As you listen to the evidence, be aware of the fact that she, that is, Ms. Cochran, does not have to prove herself innocent. The state has the burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, to demonstrate that Natalie Cochran killed her husband with premeditation, deliberation, and malice. And that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence will show the state cannot do. They cannot do it. You will see exhibits, you will see documents here, consider it all. But what comes to mind immediately is that bottle of insulin. And I will submit to you that this is a smokescreen that the state is going to present to you. You will hear expert testimony and evidence that this type of insulin could not kill anybody. And for that matter, that the amount of insulin that may have been given to Michael Cochran would not kill him. The state will not tell you exactly what happened that day. Well, they will tell you what they believe happened that day after Mr. Cochran was allegedly shot with this insulin. But what they will not tell you is that if you are shot with a injection of insulin, you're not going to drop unconscious immediately. Think about what would happen if somebody injected you with insulin. Would you react? Would you call 911? Now let's think about it. Let's also think about the fact that the evidence in this case is not exactly what the state believed you to be. Mr. Cochran was a 38-year-old man who died, and the question still remains, what did he die of? You will hear medical evidence that Mr. Cochran was not a healthy 38-year-old man. In fact, to the contrary, between the late 2017 and the time of his death in 2019, he was in the hospital 4 times. For what? For life-threatening conditions. He was a ticking bomb, the evidence will show, health-wise. He suffered from a plethora of medical conditions that could easily end up his life. What's more, you will hear the evidence that Mr. Cochran fancied himself to be a bodybuilder. He wanted to be the Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mr. Universe. And what did he do to that, in that regard? Mr. Cochran has imported, well, let's call it medication, from Mexico, online, from sources that were not approved by any FDA or any legitimate American government sources. And he was taking medication, steroids, that were not for human consumption. That there was some animal medication taken only by the animals. So consider that. Consider that. He was not a healthy man. He was in the hospital in 2017 for his back problems. Let's maybe even disregard that. But he was again in the hospital for mold exposure, with the symptoms similar to what happened to him in February of 2019. He hated the hospitals, the evidence will show. He told everybody that if they ever took him to the hospital, it would be a waste of money, and he would not want to stay in a hospital. But 2 days later, he was again in a hospital with the same conditions, even worse. Somehow he survived. His medical conditions, you will hear, involve the swelling of the brain, convulsions, perhaps epilepsy. You will hear all that evidence. He was not a healthy man. And he refused to take medications. He was pumping himself with steroids and whatever other medication there was that he could get from less than legitimate sources. And you have to consider that in arriving at your verdict. Secondly, the evidence will show that the state's medical evidence as such is going to be easily discredited by the expert evidence of people who, expert witnesses, who will tell you that this type of medication, what he had, could not have killed this man. And on top of that, the facts of the case are also different from what the prosecution told you. In fact, the insulin, you will hear about all this insulin. This is a smokescreen. The insulin that my client had in her possession was the insulin that Mr. and Mrs. Davis gave her repeatedly. Why? Because they had a diabetic son. And Natalie was an expert in administering that medication because their next door neighbor had a son who had diabetes 1. Sad to hear that, but that's the reality of it. It was not a one-time deal. She was in fact entitled to go to the pharmacy and get that medication, pick up the medication for Mr. and Mrs. Davis's son. So the fact that she had any insulin in her home is of no import. Furthermore, the state will present the evidence that they found a bottle of insulin in her home. We will, however, present to you that that bottle of insulin was first of all full, so nobody took that insulin. Second of all, that insulin was found in the refrigerator 4 months after Mr. Cochran's death. That insulin is completely irrelevant, as the evidence will show. Now, the state wants you to believe that Ms. Cochran, as a pharmacist, is knowledgeable of the insulin because she wanted to kill her husband. The evidence, however, will show that Ms. Cochran, as a pharmacist, is also known to have great knowledge of any other substances that could kill, undetectable, untraceable. And so consider this evidence. Let's assume that the state is right on everything. Consider the fact that this cold-blooded killer borrows a murder weapon from a neighbor to kill her husband with the insulin that involves now a couple of witnesses. Then she places that medicine in her refrigerator, the evidence of the crime apparently according to the state, for 4 months. And then she somehow does not use any other substances that she knows of because she is a pharmacist. That theory is absurd, ladies and gentlemen. Truly. And now, the kicker. She has an absolute power to hide the evidence. And the evidence will show that she had never cremated her husband. So he was exhumed, his body was exhumed, so that the state would prove something, which the state cannot, but at least they try. And we will submit to you that if she had cremated the late Mr. Cochran's body, there would have been no case. There would have been any case. Now, you will hear the evidence about her chemo treatment, You will hear the evidence about her health. And, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, after all of that, you will come to the realization that the state's case doesn't make any sense. And you will not be able to answer your own question, perhaps. What did this man die of? Certainly not the insulin injection. And the evidence will also show that Mr. Cochran, by the state's own admission, was enjoying the benefits of Ms. Cochran's fraud. Well, that's another red herring. He was involved in the Ponzi scheme. He knew about multi-million-dollar purchases, the toys, the houses, trips to Paris, trips to Hawaii, expensive, lavish lifestyle. And you have to ask yourself at the end of the case, he didn't know about it? Really? He didn't know how this money was generated? He who wrote all the contracts for the government, for the non-existing purchases? If you cannot answer these questions, then you have to acquit the defendant. This is a complex case, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. But it's built by the state of West Virginia on conjectures and innuendos. It is rich on spurious conclusions and speculations. But it's thin on facts. And glaringly lacking in motive.